Hiya.
Now at 10, the BBC News with Sophie Raworth.
Tonight at 10, new COVID restrictions for all passengers travelling from China to England from next week. As China prepares to fully reopen its borders, the British government says anyone travelling here will need a negative COVID test before flying. Scientists say it could provide some useful information.
I think this is really a cosmetic thing. I think really the value is in the data that we can get from China in terms of what's doing the rounds, what's spreading, what the virus is doing, how it's evolving.
Also on the programme tonight, the controversial social media figure Andrew Tate, widely criticised for his misogynistic posts, is being held with his brother in custody for 30 days in Romania by police investigating human trafficking and rape offences. The family of Elle Edwards, who was shot dead on Christmas Eve, paid tribute to their daughter as police make a fresh appeal for information. 6 years of tax returns, which the former President Donald Trump refused to make public, have been released in the US. Good evening. From next Thursday, people coming to England from China will need to test for COVID before flying after the government announced new COVID restrictions. There will be random testing for some passengers on arrival too. The Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, says the measure is temporary but will allow scientists to gain rapid insight into potential new variants circulating in China. It comes after China finally relaxed its strict COVID restrictions that have been in place since the start of the pandemic, triggering a sharp rise in the number of COVID cases there. China will fully reopen its borders for the first time since 2020 next week, allowing substantially more international travellers to fly in and Chinese citizens to leave. Our political correspondent Helen Catt reports.
A flight touching down this evening at Heathrow from Qingdao. From Thursday, anyone travelling to England from mainland China will have to show a negative COVID test to fly. From a week on Sunday, a sample of passengers at Heathrow will also be tested on arrival. The government says it's a precaution due to a lack of comprehensive information from the Chinese government. The country has seen a surge of coronavirus, which analysts claim is being underreported.
The reason there are millions of cases of coronavirus infection happening is because the population there are either unvaccinated or under-vaccinated, using Chinese vaccines that don't work as well as the mRNA vaccines that we've been using in Western countries. And the consequence is that there's a really big surge in infections, and what people are concerned about is that among those new infections there may be new variants of the virus.
It's not thought that any new variants of coronavirus are circulating in China. Yesterday, ministers here had said that meant they had no plans to introduce testing. Some had urged the government to consider it and are pleased at the change of heart.
The approach we've taken on board does make it clear to the Chinese authorities that given their lack of transparency on their data, we will have to put in measures. And it does do some improvement on protecting the NHS. So it is not the full measure, but I think it's pragmatic and a sensible first step.
The changes will bring England in line with the United States. France has tonight too said it will bring in mandatory testing. Italy, India and Japan are among other countries which have already done so. The UK government says it will review the temporary measures if China improves on its transparency and information sharing.
And Helen is with me now. So the return of restrictions, at least for people flying from China into England, how significant a move is it?
Well, I think politically it is quite significant. We haven't had any sort of COVID measures on international travel for quite a while, so to reimpose them is quite a significant move. And I think partly that might be why the government is very keen to stress that these measures are temporary. They're also very keen to stress that they are a precaution and that the numbers of people coming to the UK from mainland China are very low still. But a government source I was speaking to earlier said that there is real concern about this lack of information from China particularly, and lack of of clarity around Chinese vaccines. So that's what's led them to make this move. Another interesting point, actually, that Lord Bethell, who you just heard from, raised with me when I was speaking to him earlier, is what does this say about how the government will respond to threats and risks going forward? Because COVID hasn't gone away. Are they going to take a more cautious, safe but sorry type approach?
Helen, thank you. The controversial social media figure Andrew Tate has been remanded in custody in Romania along with his brother for 30 days as part of an investigation into sex trafficking and rape. The 36-year-old was arrested yesterday in Romania, where he has been living for the past 5 years. Both he and his brother deny all charges. Andrew Tate has a huge online following, particularly among teenage boys, but several platforms have banned him for offensive and misogynistic comments. Our culture editor, Katie Razzle, reports.
The social media star you might never have heard of, but your teenage children most likely will have. Provocative and condemned for extreme misogyny, Andrew Tate regularly shows off his supposedly luxurious lifestyle online and seems to relish causing offence.
It's been proven that the smartest people in the world are men.
See, that's,
but
I think
that's been proven.
And I said that female infidelity is more disgusting than male infidelity. And I think that the world agrees with me.
Earlier today, Tate and his brother were arrested at their compound in Bucharest, accused by the Romanian authorities of recruiting, housing and exploiting women by forcing them to create pornographic content. The suspects are alleged to have set up an organised crime group.
Hello.
So how did Tate, who calls himself the most famous man on the planet and has had billions of views on social media, become so popular, mainly with teenage boys? Campaigners against digital hate speech say he is adept at manipulating the way content spreads online.
And what he's done is create highly controversial content, cultivated a group of followers, but also haters who work together in reality, mathematically, to amplify his content, to engage with it, whether it's to hate tweet it or to praise it. And through that, he's built himself enormous global brand.
A global brand of huge influence. And earlier this year, Tate did an interview in his Romanian home with the Times journalist Hugo Rifkind.
He does manage to speak to teenage boys in a way that few people do, because teenage boys can think a lot of nasty things, and they quite like the validation of somebody older repeating those nasty things back to them. And he did that in a very, very uncomplicated way.
Tate is banned from most social media platforms, but that hasn't stopped his views spreading. An influencer whose influence shows no sign of waning. Katie Razzle, BBC News.
Merseyside police have again appealed for anyone with information about the murder of Elle Edwards to come forward, saying those responsible don't deserve protection or to be walking the streets. Elle was fatally shot on Christmas Eve as she celebrated with friends in Wallasey. Officers don't believe she was the intended target. Danny Savage has been following the investigation, a warning his report contains some flash photography.
At Merseyside Police Headquarters today, Elle Edwards' father, Tim, sat next to the officer leading the hunt for his daughter's killer. For him and his family, life will never be the same again. The officer read out a statement on their behalf.
She had this way about her that as soon as you met her, you instantly fell in love with her. Everyone that knew and met Elle knew how special she was. She loved life and had so many amazing plans for the future. My beautiful Ellie Marlene is the love of my life, and she is my world, my best friend. She will always shine and be beautiful and bright. My Ellie has never gone.
Elle was having a drink outside this pub in Wallasey on Christmas Eve when she was fatally wounded. Someone repeatedly fired a gun at a group of drinkers. Of the 4 other people injured, 3 have been released from hospital. 1 is still undergoing treatment. Police still haven't found a dark-coloured Mercedes used in the attack or the gun. They want anyone with information about where they could be to come forward, along with details about who was involved.
These people don't deserve to be walking our streets. They don't deserve to be protected. They belong in prison. Guns have no place on the streets of Merseyside, and we're dedicated to getting weapons off the streets. Silence is never an option.
Of the 3 people arrested so far, 1 man is still being questioned and a woman has been released on bail. A 30-year-old man arrested on Boxing Day on suspicion of murder has been recalled to prison. Danny Savage, BBC News, Wallasey on Merseyside.
Donald Trump's tax returns have finally been released, ending a bitter 6-year-long battle to gain greater insights into the finances of the former US president. Our Washington correspondent Gary O'Donoghue has been looking through them. What do they show us?
Well, Sophie, you're right. This has been a battle that Donald Trump has fought tooth and nail, both in public and in the courts, right up to the Supreme Court, which lost the case against him last month. What they show is a pattern of business losses and of paying relatively small amounts of income tax, federal income tax. For example, in 2 years of the 6, the former president only paid $1,500 in income tax, and for the last year, he paid no income tax whatsoever. Now, he has said during that whole period of time that he couldn't publish these tax returns, which presidential candidates have done pretty much for 50 years, because he was under audit. What we've also discovered today is that was not true. There was only 1 year in that period where the Internal Revenue Service was looking at his tax returns. He's attacked this release, calling it part of a witch hunt, part of a politicization of financial and private records. And Republicans who take control of the House of Representatives next week have vowed to do the same to Democrats, to dig in to the finances of Joe Biden and perhaps even his son, Hunter Biden. So, Sophie, if the gloves weren't off now, they are going to be much more so in the coming weeks.
Gary, thank you. There's been another sharp rise in the number of people needing hospital treatment for flu. Close to 4,000 people were in hospital in the run-up to Christmas, compared to just under 800 at the start of December. Health leaders say a twindemic of flu and COVID is putting extra pressure on an already stretched NHS. Here's our medical editor, Fergus Walsh.
Flu is back with a vengeance. People feeling unwell are being urged to avoid spreading flu and other viruses to those more vulnerable. New figures for hospitals in England show the impact of the surge in cases. Last week, more than 3,700 patients a day were in hospital in England with flu. That's up almost 80% in just a week. Compared with a month ago, it's a 7-fold increase. And admissions are up 100-fold on the same time last year, when there was almost no flu circulating because people weren't mixing. Of those in hospital with flu now, 267 are in critical care. Health bosses say fears of a twindemic of flu and COVID have been realised.
Rapidly rising flu numbers over the course of December, coinciding with the 5th wave of COVID we've had in 2022, over 9,000 COVID patients in hospitals in England once again. So that means the twindemic of flu and COVID is piling additional pressure onto an already severely stretched NHS.
Those rising COVID infection levels are having an impact on staff sickness. Around 8,000 NHS staff a day are off due to COVID, up significantly on last month. A further sign of pressure on the NHS can be seen by the level of hospital bed occupancy. 93%, more than 9 in 10 beds are filled, up from 86% in the same period last year. And more than 12,000 beds, around 1 in 8, are taken up by patients fit to be discharged, but who can't leave as the right support in the community is not available.
Little sharp scratch.
The figures today are for England, but the rising levels of flu and other winter viruses are being experienced UK-wide. The NHS is urging those eligible for a flu or COVID jab who haven't yet come forward to get vaccinated. Fergus Walsh, BBC News.
Motorists in Scotland have been dealing with difficult driving conditions after heavy rain brought flooding to some parts of the country today. 33 flood warnings, including one severe warning, are in place, with parts of Dumfries and Galloway and the Scottish borders amongst the affected areas. There are also yellow weather warnings of snow and ice covering northern Scotland. Transport campaigners have welcomed a temporary £2 cap on local bus fares in England between January and March next year, but they warn that further cuts to services could be on the way. Bus companies say some routes are no longer viable because of falling passenger numbers and rising costs. Here's our transport correspondent, Katie Austin.
About half of journeys on public transport in England are made on buses. Here in the northwest of Sheffield, though, people say there are no longer enough of them.
Rubbish up here. We've been really let down a hell of a lot. Before, when we used to have a reliable bus service, I could get out more, but now it makes it, you can't, you're stuck.
They've been non-existent, really, but it might sound silly, but they've put brand new bus shelters up and we've got no buses.
A couple of miles away, I met Graham, a local bus user and campaigner.
A lot of the routes have been cut, and the trouble is also that even if you look at the timetable for the reduced services, the buses often just don't turn up at all, and it leaves people being late for appointments. It means that people can't get to their church. It means a lot more people, will be using their cars, and it just means we're getting worse and worse pollution in our area.
A charity which calls for more and improved public transport says it's an issue across the country.
We hear from people almost on a daily basis to let us know that their bus service has been cut, that the route's been changed. Our research at Campaign for Transport showed that they've disappeared by a quarter the number of bus services in the last decade, and we are still seeing cuts. Unfortunately, there's a funding issue, and unless there is more funding for local bus services, we will see more cuts.
The provision of bus services has been declining for a number of years, and the pandemic has had a big impact on top of that. Passenger numbers still haven't recovered to what they were before, and despite emergency funding from the government over the past couple of years, some operators say a number of routes just aren't viable anymore.
Their trade body insists operators try to thin out services rather than withdraw them, but sometimes there's no alternative.
Our costs are up about 25% through rising fuel prices, rising cost of living, which is feeding through into the amount we need to pay our drivers. At the same time, passenger numbers are down considerably.
Some areas, including Sheffield, have already brought in a £2 cap on the cost of single bus journeys. The buses minister said the same fare cap being available across most of England for 3 months from January would encourage more people back onto buses. He said the government had already put millions into supporting services.
What I want to see is a reliable service for the future, which people can know it's going to be there when it says it's going to be there, and it's also affordable for people to use. And that's why I think it's really important to try and have schemes to get that ridership back on.
The bus industry says it's trying to keep as many routes as possible, but challenges still lie ahead. Some passengers worry services they relied on have gone for good. Katie Austin, BBC News in Sheffield.
In Brazil, 3 days of national mourning have been declared in honour of the footballer Pele, who died yesterday in Sao Paulo. Pele was known by many as the king of football, the only player to have won the World Cup 3 times, as our South America correspondent Katie Watson reports.
Brazil's most famous landmark, paying tribute to Brazil's most famous name. And at Santos, the club where Pele played for so many years, Brazilians came to mark his passing. The whole nation is in mourning for a man who defined the beautiful game.
Pele. And number 3.
Pele made it against the odds. In an often racist and classist country, this poor, black and exceptionally talented footballer was a success story right from the very beginning. A player who stayed true to his Brazilian roots, but who had fans the world over.
He absolutely transcended his sport. The man on the pitch, the man off the pitch, the dignity and grace that he seemed to exude for the people around him. I don't think they make them like that anymore. Truly a great.
And those qualities were remembered at Sao Paulo's Museum of Football today. The exhibition space filled with memories of Pelé. This was the shirt he wore in 1970 when he won his 3rd World Cup title. It was packed with Brazilians of all ages who came to pay their respects.
For us, he's a national symbol who turned into an international symbol, who took our country to all corners of the world. We say he's our king. Brazil may not have a monarchy, but in football, we have our king, who sadly left us.
I don't think Pele has died. It's Edson. Pele and his legacy will be eternal. With the football he achieved in his era, imagine what he could have done with today's technology.
Brazilians always keen for a photo opportunity. Today of all days was one to remember.
It's been a day of reflection here in Brazil, and I think this headline sums it up. Pele died, if indeed Pele can die, because his influence here in Brazil will remain for generations to come.
Preparations are underway at his club in Santos, where a public wake will be held from Monday. Big crowds are expected. Brazilians want to remember their beloved king. Katie Watson, BBC News in Sao Paulo.
Here, football fans have been paying their respects to Pele tonight as the New Year Premier League round of fixtures got underway. West Ham suffered a 2-0 defeat at home by Brentford, while Liverpool were gifted a 2-1 win against Leicester at Anfield, as Joe Curry now reports. Time for a look at the weather now. Chris Fuchs is here. What's it going to be like for New Year's Eve?
Well, a real mixed picture. But, earlier on we were looking at the severe flooding that we've seen in parts of Scotland. Dumfries and Galloway picked up 70 millimetres of rain in the space of 24 hours. That was the wettest place. Real mixed bag, though, coming up for New Year's Eve. We've got some heavy rain, mild weather for England and Wales, but cold weather for Scotland with a risk of some snow. The air coming from very different places then. These strong southwesterly winds dragging the mild air in across England and Wales. The cold northerly winds bringing the risk of some snow later on in the night across parts of northern Scotland, with a threat of icy stretches here as the winds start to calm down later in the night. Further south, the end of the night, temperatures 10 to 12 degrees Celsius quite widely across England and Wales. A very, very mild night, but still quite blowy. And for tomorrow, we've got more rain in the forecast. Now, this rain is falling already on saturated ground across the south of England and Wales, so there's a risk of seeing some localised surface water flooding here. Not too much in the way of rain further northwards, but we still have those snow showers pushing into Scotland, where there could be a few centimetres building in places. So a cold day for Scotland, milder further south, 10 to even 14 degrees Celsius. And then as we edge closer to those New Year celebrations, we've got some rain coming in across northern England, Northern Ireland. Some showers to the south of this. And for Scotland, well, we've still got that cold air in place. Now, there is a risk as this band of rain continues to bump into that colder air, particularly into the early hours, I think, of New Year's Day, that we could start to see some of the rain turn to snow. There's a lot of uncertainty about this, but if the area of low pressure driving this is a bit deeper, we could get some heavy snow and even potentially seeing some of that snow get down to lower levels. So it's something we're just monitoring at the moment. Still wintry weather then left over in Scotland as we head through New Year's Day. Further southwards, we've got the mild southwesterly winds. Not as wet a day. There'll be some showers around, but also some brighter spells, and temperatures still very mild. 5 degrees above average for December or early January, 12 or 13 degrees, the forecast high as we head into the first day of the new year. Sophie.
Yes, thank you. And that's it from us on Friday, the 30th of December. The news continues here, though, on BBC One, because it's time to join our colleagues across the nations and regions for the news where you are. From the 10 team, it is good night. Bye-bye.